Good afternoon, sirs and ma'ams. Welcome on board to our third session, the Applied Economic session. This is Dr. Ufuk Bingöl from Bandırma 17 Eylül University. In this session, we mostly talked about empirical researches. Actually, we should start with Dr. Onur Akkaya and Mehmet Şentürk, but on the next session, they are currently presenting their studies. Because of that, I will get them at the end of our session. So we will continue. We will start with Professor Remzi Kaygusuz from Sabancı University. Sir, if you're ready, Professor Remzi Kaygusuz will present us the macroeconomic implications of childcare on earnings and consumptions inequality. Sir, I may give you like 15 minutes for your presentations. Now I will give permission to share your screen. Now it is ready, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Ufuk Hoca. So let me try. Okay, present now. A window. Let me figure this out. Sorry. All right.
Yes, sir.
You can see my slides, right?
Perfect. Clear.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for including my paper in the conference. It's great to be part of this conference. I'm from Sabancı University, as I said, and I'm going to today talk about the macroeconomic implications of childcare on earnings and consumption inequality. So there is already an existing literature that documents that childcare costs are really important for female labor force participation. And we also know that non-participation in the labor market have some significant consequences on female human capital accumulation. So in this paper, what I'm going to do is I'm going to investigate the role of childcare costs on inequality in household earnings and inequality in household consumption. I will begin with documenting some facts on inequality over the life cycle for different types of households, for married, single, skilled, and unskilled. And I'm going to develop a life cycle economy that's going to account for these facts. And then I'm going to use my framework to understand quantitatively the consequences of fully subsidizing childcare costs on earnings inequality, consumption inequality, etc. Okay, let me begin with the facts. So what kind of facts that I'm going to talk about? So over here, you see the wages of males and females over the life cycle for skilled and unskilled. Okay, so what we know, what we learn from these facts, again, all these facts are for US data. What we know from the data is the following. For skilled people, hourly wages grow faster than for unskilled workers. This slide is about the inequality in wages for males, okay? And the inequality in wages is measured by looking at the variance of log wages. What we learn from this picture is the following. Inequality in wages for males increased significantly. This is true for both married and single, and it's also true for skilled and unskilled male workers. For females, this is not true. For both single and married people, married females, we observe the following. The inequality in wages first increase up until ages 35 to 40, but then after that age, the inequality remains constant, almost constant. So there is a difference between the inequality in wages for males and females. This difference is reflected on the inequality in earnings. This picture is showing you the inequality in the female earnings, which is shown with the blue line, and inequality in male earnings shown with the red line. So again, in line with what I told you earlier, inequality in female earnings rises at first, but stabilizes after age 35 or so. But for males, there is a steady increase in inequality over the life cycle. Labor force, this is about labor force participation of females, married females. Due to childbearing, we know that females drop out of the labor force, and that's shown in this picture, okay? And it's more pronounced for skilled females than for unskilled females. So after having their children, some married females drop out of labor force, but then they come back. So there is this U-shaped pattern that we get for both skilled and unskilled female workers. Let me tell you about the wage-gender gap. So we know that the wages of the males and females are different. We call it as the gender wage gap, and this gender wage gap increases over the life cycle, as you see in this picture, and the increase is steeper for the skilled people. Finally, I'm going to tell you about some well-known fact. Inequality in earnings, which is shown with the blue line, rises much faster over the life cycle than the inequality in consumption. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you a model that's going to account for all these facts. Okay, so we have a life cycle economy where we have males and females. These agents are going to differ in terms of their education. The education of a male is going to determine the deterministic part of his life cycle productivity profile, omega, shown with omega. The education of the female will determine her age 1 productivity profile. Okay, and after age 1, the deterministic part of her productivity is going to evolve endogenously. Agents can be single or married, and the marital status of a person is going to be exogenously given. So it's not going to be decided within the model. Married households or single females can have children, and if they do, they can have it early in life or later in life. In this model, this version, households will exactly have 2 children, as in the data. And the first and the second children will arrive with 2 years distance. Okay? If a female with children works, married or single, then the household has to pay childcare costs, and the childcare costs will depend on the age of the children at home. If both spouses decide on labor force participation, then as a unit, the household is going to incur a utility cost of Q, and this utility cost is going to be compounded with a term that's going to depend on the age of the youngest child at home. As I told you, the education of the female will determine her age 1 productivity, but after this age, her productivity profile is going to evolve endogenously. If she works, which is going to be captured with a value of 1 for chi, if she works, her human capital is going to appreciate, and it's going to appreciate by alpha EX. The appreciation rate is going to depend on her experience E and her education X. If she doesn't work, then her human capital is going to depreciate at rate delta, which is going to again depend on her education. Children are costly. There is also a utility cost of having 2 earners in the labor market, but there are also benefits of having 2 earners in the market. So the households are going to compare the costs to benefits, and they will decide whether the females should participate or not. Let me tell you about the shocks that agents are facing in this model. So over here in this expression, you see the earnings of a single male, the deterministic part of his life cycle productivity, but there are also shocks. He gets a permanent shock at the beginning of the life cycle, shown with eta. He also gets persistent shocks over the life cycle, shown with nu. The permanent shock eta is going to be drawn from a normal distribution. The persistent shock is going to follow a random walk. A very similar structure for a single female, except that her human capital evolves endogenously. Okay. Again, there will be a permanent shock coming from a normal distribution for the single female, and her the persistent shock that she gets again will be governed with a random walk. Over here, you see the labor earnings for a married couple. Okay, this is for her and this is for him. For the husband, no, yeah, for the wife, she gets a permanent shock and a persistent shock. For the husband, he gets a permanent shock and a persistent shock. What's different over here is that their shocks are potentially correlated. Okay, so the persistent shocks are potentially correlated, and the permanent shocks are potentially correlated, and we allow for that. So there are many parameters over here. The variances depend on gender, skill, and marital status. So we have to pin down all these parameter values. What we do is we infer these variances and covariances from the data by looking at the inequality in wages and correlations in wages between spouses at different stages in the life cycle. Let me tell you about the utility function of individuals. As singles, they like consumption. They don't like to work, okay? Married couples, they enjoy consumption. He doesn't like to work, she doesn't like to work. And if both of them participate in the market, the household as a unit incurs a utility cost, all right, as I told you earlier. There is a representative firm that takes care of the production in the economy. There's a Koblack's production function available to this firm. We allow for imperfect substitution between skilled labor and unskilled labor. There is also a government in this economy. Households pay income taxes based on their marital status, income, and number of children at home. In another paper with my co-authors, we estimate tax functions for the US economy, and I use these tax functions in this benchmark economy. Households pay capital income taxes, shown with tau K. They also pay social security taxes, shown with tau P. In addition to taxes, there are tax credits and child care subsidies. There is earned income tax credit, child tax credit, child and dependent care tax credit. Okay, so all of them are modeled exactly as they are in the actual implementation in US. Okay, there is also a child care subsidy program. Not everyone is eligible for child care subsidies. There is means testing. If the household is eligible, then 75% of the child care costs are paid by the government, but only 5% of households are going to be eligible for child care subsidies, as in the data. In addition to these, there are some transfers from the government, okay, and these transfers are going to be shown with these functions that are going to be, again, depending on the marital status, income, and number of children. Basically, we use survey of income and program participation data to estimate these transfer functions. Okay, so in this graph, you see the following. In the model economy, we get the pattern between transfers and household income that you see in this picture. Okay, so what we observe is low-income households get a significant amount of transfers from the government. Okay, so these are annualized per year. Okay, let me quickly tell you about the decisions that households are going to make. Households have access to one period risk-free asset. They are going to decide on how much to consume, how much to save, and how much to work. Okay, this is going to include a participation decision for the females. Given their states, the household is going to compare the cost of work for the female, which is going to be coming from childcare expenses, additional taxes that have to be paid. There will be also benefits of work. When she works, there will be extra income to the household. Her human capital is going to appreciate. Taxation and the generosity of transfers will also affect the costs and benefits of work for the female. Okay, so I'm done with talking about the model. Let me tell you about how the model does relative to the data. Okay, so in this table, you see our targets, and the model does very well in terms of replicating the targets. And same here. We remember I am parameterizing the shock structure to make certain inequality statistics over the life cycle, and the model does very well in terms of replicating these inequality numbers. Okay, so let me go back to the beginning of my presentation and relate what I'm going to tell you now to that. Well, the model does well in terms of replicating the facts that I showed you earlier. Okay, so in the model and in the data, the inequality in wages for males and for married males and single males, for skilled and unskilled, increases significantly over the life cycle. So we observed this pattern in the model and in the data. The model does very well in terms of capturing that. Okay, so remember, the picture for the females was different. The good thing about the model is it's able to generate that. One thing that I want you to remember as well is the following: female human capital evolves endogenously. Okay, so what you get, for these dashed lines are endogenously determined. Okay, so endogenously the model does very well in terms of reproducing these facts. Same is true for the inequality in earnings for married females. The model does very well in terms of reproducing the data. Okay, remember there was an asymmetry between males and females. For the males, there was a steadily increasing inequality over the life cycle. That's kind of mechanic, but for the females, it's not mechanic because there is this labor force participation decision for the female, and also there is this endogenous human capital accumulation for the female. Okay. The model does very well in terms of reproducing the labor force participation of skilled and unskilled married females. Okay. And the model also does pretty well in terms of getting how the gender gap looks like for skilled and unskilled people over the life cycle. Okay, so let me quickly tell you about the quantitative exercise in the last 2 minutes that I have. So what I do is I now counterfactually remove the childcare cost by increasing the subsidy to 100% and making it available for everyone. Okay, to achieve revenue neutrality, I scale up the income taxes in the benchmark economy. All right. So what happens to the inequality? Well, this picture shows the inequality in female earnings over the life cycle. The orange one is the benchmark model, and the green one is the case where we increase subsidies to 100%. So what we observe is that when the childcare subsidies are expanded, more females participate in the labor market. They don't drop out of labor force in childbearing years, like between 25 to 35. Therefore, inequality becomes higher than the benchmark economy. All right, but at latter years, the inequality in the 100% case is going to be smaller than the benchmark model, and the intuition is as follows. In the benchmark model, females drop out. Only select females remain in the market in early ages because of childcare cost. Some of them come back. When they come back, they increase the inequality in female earnings. That is not as pronounced in the alternative economy with 100% subsidies. That's why the inequality in earnings for females after age 35 is lower. Okay. This table shows how the aggregates change. When we fully subsidize the childcare cost, labor force participation of females go up. Because of higher taxes, hours of workers go down. Okay, but at the end of the day, output in the economy increases by about 3%. At the aggregate level, household earnings, the inequality in household earnings does not really change much. Okay, but we find that inequality in household consumption increases significantly. Okay. All right, I think I'm almost out of time. Let me quickly conclude. Fully subsidizing childcare has substantial effects on macroeconomic aggregates. As I just told you, labor force participation of married females increases substantially. Inequality in female earnings declines early in the life cycle, but increases later in the life cycle. And overall consumption inequality increases. Okay. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, I admire your presentation, and I'm looking forward to your full paper because I'm working in the labor economics and industrial relations department. So, admirable presentation. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
So, We will continue with Professor Emre Ünal and Professor Nezir Köse. Professor Emre Ünal is probably, as far as I remember, working from Japan. Are you in Japan, in Turkey, sir?
No, I am in Turkey now.
You came back. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. So I'm giving my word to you.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Let me.
By the way, I will take all questions and contribution at the end of this session. You may still write it on a chat site related with Professor Remzi Kaygusuz's presentation or the other presenters. Thank you.
Okay, so, can you see the screen?
Yes, clearly, sir.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think this is fine like this, if it is not a problem. I am using two different devices because my computer doesn't have a camera.
It's okay, sir.
So the topic is the impact of the interest rate on industrial production during the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me introduce myself. I graduated from Istanbul University and I got my master degree there, and I continued my PhD in Japan, Kyoto University, and also a postdoc. I research basically about East Asian economies, and my research interest is input-output analysis and usually the institutional economics. I have top published research also this year, the effects of oil price and oil price volatility on inflation in Turkey, published in Energy, and also an input-output analysis and institutional approach to automotive industry in China and Turkey. It is published in Evolutionary and Institutional Economics Review. So if you have any research interest about this topic, you can contact with me. So let's start from introduction. The main aim of the research is to analyze the impact of the real interest rate on industrial production in developed and developing countries during the 2008 financial crisis and COVID-19 pandemic. Recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has become an important obstacle to economic growth. The developed and developing economies experience negative growth, rising unemployment, and deepening macroeconomic instabilities. The 2008 financial crisis globally impacted on economic growth as well. This period witnessed the use of a tool. Usually the countries started using the interest rate to influence economic performance. In normal periods of economic growth, the market usually likes the low real interest rate that can create investment. And during the low economic growth periods, again, the real interest rate plays a role in stimulating growth through consumption and production. So to promote economic growth and reduce the effect of a crisis, a decrease in real interest rate can play a role until the economy returns to its potential growth path again. To support industrial production, which is a strong dynamic behind economic growth, the real interest rate is an option to be used. So to analyze this relationship, which might help many countries to think about the role of interest rate behind industrial production, especially in the periods of crisis or pandemics, such as the 2008 financial crisis and 2009 and the COVID-19 pandemic. It is assumed that the real interest rate in these periods can impact on industrial production. So the main questions of these works are firstly, the impact of real interest rate on industrial production growth during the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, and the difference in its impact between the developed and developing countries. Secondly, whether the interest rate can serve as a tool of monetary policy to assist growth. Here is the country list, the developed and developing countries. Okay, this maybe will be better. Okay, list of countries, developed countries: Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, United Kingdom, Canada, United States, Japan. And developing countries are Brazil, India, Mexico, Russia, South Africa, and Turkey. We separated these countries according to their inflation levels. For example, developing countries experiences high inflation growth than developed countries. So it is expected that the interest rate policy will be different between the countries. Sorry, there is a problem. I will open again. I am very sorry for that. Okay, I am very sorry. So I was in list of countries. So the first, why we consider these countries, because it is expected that the interest rate policy will be different according to their inflation level. For example, the average inflation was approximately 9% in developing economies, and Russia, South Africa, and Turkey experienced about 10% inflation. The average inflation was 3.1% in developed countries. And these countries are categorized, for example, developed countries as low inflation group, and the developing economies categorized as high inflation group. Thus, the effect of interest rate in this group can be analyzed and explored as to whether the real interest rate works better in high or low inflation countries in the periods of crisis. And the second reason why we consider these countries, it is because their data availability. These countries have data covering the time periods concerned in the research. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to be a problem, and it is assumed that it will keep the world busy for a couple of years. Having the latest data information was judged to be important for the analysis. So these countries had the data availability, so we could include them into the analysis. And the third reason is that most of these countries also have been impacted severely by the pandemic. For example, United States, Brazil, India, Russia, and all these countries are in our analysis group. The variables considered for the research are the two variables, the real interest rate and the industrial production index. The countries that were selected have market economies which allow interest rate to fluctuate. This is very important. For example, in some countries, there is still not a free market economy. So these countries have market economies where the interest rate can fluctuate and have the power to influence industrial production. So it is assumed that industrial production will be impacted by interest rate policy. So unexpected periods such as crises and pandemics can meet with a decreasing real interest rate to support industrial production. A high interest rate when a country experiences lower economic growth can increase financial costs. Therefore, a negative relationship is expected during the crisis or economic slowdowns to recover and revive the economic growth. But the impact of interest rate can be different in developed and developing economies, especially in the periods of crisis. The countries experienced drops in economic growth, decreasing trade, rising unemployment. This caused uncertainty for the future of economies. These countries are looking away to reduce the effect of COVID-19 pandemic. However, the effect of pandemic on economic activities can be different than that of economic crisis. So let me talk about the current work. This research is to create implication by considering the current situation. To understand the role of interest rate, the work took into account the developed and developing economies that had low and high inflation respectively. In particular, it analyzed in which country group industrial production showed a more significant response to the real interest rate. The research included the main countries that faced the pandemic and examined the situation using panel data analysis. Most of the research was limited solely to interest rate policy and its pass-through effect in May, considering variable in the area of financial market. Nevertheless, the impact of interest rate on industrial production should be researched as well. This is a study that creates a direct relationship between the two variables. The work also includes a large number of countries analyzing the periods of 2008 financial crisis and COVID-19 pandemic. The impact of real interest rate during the crisis is also examined. Regarding the effects of interest rate policy, the differences between the periods of 2008 financial crisis and COVID-19 pandemic are interpreted for developed and developing economies. So this is expected to shine a light on measures to mitigate the effect of pandemic. And assumptions for the work. During the periods of potential economic growth, when monetary policy is free to respond to market conditions, it is assumed that real interest rate can be a tool for stimulating growth. In periods of recessions, it is assumed that a falling real interest rate can assist economic recovery from a crisis. Lowering the real interest rate can help revive markets in times of economic crisis. Furthermore, understanding the effects of interest rate policy can influence other policies, such as unconventional monetary policy, in support of economic activities. Following such a policy can also change expectations in private sector and thus reduce the effects of financial crisis. A high real interest rate can negatively impact on economic growth. A lower interest rate policy can promote industrial production. First, it can lower the debt burden on industries that need to invest for their production process. Second, expansionary monetary policy can provide lower cost credits and thus stimulate domestic consumption. This promoting policy can increase production. Hence, it can be one of the main tools for mitigating the effects of economic crisis. Interest rate policy can be different between the different country groups, whereas some countries need more stimulus from interest rate policy. For others, a slight change in this monetary policy can be enough to eliminate the negative impact of declining production. In particular, it becomes a reality that a falling real interest rate in developed economies will naturally have a higher impact on industrial production due to their stages of development. In other words, a slight lowering of interest rate can have a more significant impact on industrial production in developed economies than that in developing ones. So data collection, various sources were used to collect monthly data between January 2002 and December 2020. But it was challenging to collect data for all countries from same resource. Because of that, different sources were used to derive the data. In particular, finding standard interest rate data was difficult. To increase the number of countries tested in the analysis, familiar data that can be accepted as a standard interest rate was utilized. So for developed countries, all data were derived from OECD, and also consumer price index were used to have real interest rate. And the interest rate was named the long interest rate in this data source. For developing countries, different sources were used. For example, for Turkey, interest rate as a discount rate was collected from International Financial Statistics, and industrial production index was derived from OECD. And for other countries, developing countries, for example, for Russia, the industrial production index was derived from the OECD, and the interest rate as a call money interbank rate was collected from Federal Reserve Bank of Louis. And empirical analysis here, we use some dummy variables for the real interest rate and industrial production growth rate, in particular for the 2008 global financial crisis and 2020 COVID-19 crisis periods, to separate the effects that whether the COVID-19 pandemics has similar features to the 2008 financial crisis. And also we separated the country groups according to the developing and developed ones. So panel unit root test shows that both industrial production growth and the real interest rate are stationary at 1% significant level. So according to this test, integrated orders for these variables at level are 0. Therefore, we can use panel regression for estimating only a short-run relationship between the variables. And Hausman test was implemented to decide whether to use random or fixed effects for the model. According to the results of the Hausman test, the random effect null hypothesis can be rejected at a 1% significant level. The results show that coefficient estimates from the random effects model are biased and inconsistent, and hence that a fixed effects model is preferable. And also the results of cross-section dependency test shows that null hypothesis, no cross-section dependency can be rejected at a 1% significant level. And here is the empirical analysis. The table is a little bit large, but I will discuss the situation in paragraphs so audiences can follow the results. So according to panel regression analysis, the coefficient of real interest rate is statistically significant at a 10% level. The coefficients of the other variables are statistically significant at 1% level. The results show that there was a statistically significant difference between the coefficients of the intercept term and slope. This proves that the relationship between the real interest rate and the industrial production growth causes structural change in periods of crisis. During the financial crisis and the pandemic, the impact of real interest rate on industrial production growth indicates significant differences between developed and developing countries. The impact of 2008 financial crisis shrank the industrial production growth by 9.69 units in mean. Similar to financial crisis, industrial production growth decreased approximately by 9.30 units during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we can see that the COVID-19 pandemic also indicates the features of economic crisis. One of the important, but what is the important reason behind this is that COVID-19 pandemic gave rise to strict regulations for social activities. Not only were manufacturing industries affected by decreasing demand, but also service industries were deeply impacted by lockdown. The restricted social life significantly slowed economic activities The main difference between the two periods is that the financial crisis did not constrain social activities. And moreover, government usually try to increase social and economic interaction that can stimulate consumption and production when there is an economic crisis. Nevertheless, the pandemic gave rise to governments taking measures that implemented on the market. Intervention in economic activities deepened the recession, causing a large effect as in the period of financial crisis. And this table shows the marginal effect of the real interest rate on industrial production growth in developed and developing countries. The table clearly indicates the difference between the two groups of countries in periods of recession. In addition, it gives information about how to follow interest rate policy in the two groups when economic slowdowns emerge. So I will discuss this results as paragraphs. The table shows that in normal period of growth in developing countries, the real interest rate had a significant negative impact on industrial production. A 1 unit increase in real interest rate caused a 0.05 unit negative change in industrial production. The developing countries need more resources to keep traction on the growth path. Nevertheless, in period of crisis, it is expected that there will be a recession in economic activity. In other words, industry will avoid investment and people will not consume products. This will slow down interaction between production and consumption in economic activities. To revive industrial production growth, the real interest rate policy becomes important in a way to stimulate industrial production. This time, there is a need to decrease the real interest rate. Consequently, the relationship between the two variables become negative. For developed countries, in all of the samples, in other words, the normal period of economic growth, the impact of real interest rate on industrial production was negative. It was assumed that these countries had reached a technological frontier. Their growth rates slowed down. These countries need to pull interest rates down to stimulate industrial production. However, there is not much space for central banks to focus on interest rate policy. In other words, these economies become less sensitive to interest rate as their inflation rate is already very low. Although the effect was small, 1 unit increase in real interest rate caused 0.36 unit decrease in industrial production growth. And also in the periods of recessions, the interest rate policy gains more importance in developed countries than in developing countries. In 2008 financial crisis, the impact of interest rate policy was significantly higher in developed countries than in developing countries. A 1 unit decrease in real interest rate led to 1.51 unit increase in industrial production growth. This impact was only 0.61 units in developing countries. During the COVID-19 pandemic, interest rate policy became more crucial for economic activities in both developed and developing countries compared with the period of financial crisis. When the interest rate decreased 1 unit, it increased industrial production growth by approximately 3.26 units in developed countries. And this is more than happened in 2008 financial crisis, and 0.71 units in developing countries. So this shows that the interest rate policy can work to stimulate industrial production growth in developing countries more effectively than in developing countries during the pandemic. As a consequence, it can be expected that the impact of interest rate on industrial production will be higher in developed countries than in developing countries. The marginal effect of 1 unit decrease in real interest rate on industrial production was more significant in developed countries because these countries experienced dramatically low inflation. When these countries decrease their real interest rate by 1 unit, its impact on industrial production growth becomes more effective. Developing economies have more power while nominal interest rate to stimulate growth as these countries experience higher inflation with higher interest rates. So conclusion, this work investigates how to reduce the negative influence of the COVID-19 pandemic by using the tool of interest rate. The effectiveness of interest rate policy has been analyzed for both the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic by taking account developed and developing countries. The data was collected between January 2002 and December 2020. The results indicate that for all of the data sample, the impact of real interest rate on industrial production growth was negative for both developing countries and developed countries. As most developed countries experience relatively low economic growth, their economies need to pursue lower interest rate policies in order to promote economic activity. This is because developed countries have more advanced industries in a low inflation environment. However, the low inflation rates that these countries experience makes following low real interest rate policies as a challenge. Developed countries are more affected by real interest rate policies as governments have intervened in economic activities through strict regulation of social activities. The influence of the COVID-19 pandemic on industrial production has deepened, and its impact has been larger than that was the 2008 financial crisis. Following low interest rate policies can help reduce the negative effects of the pandemic on industrial production. In developed countries, because of low inflation level, the nominal interest rate remains very low. As in periods of recession, the impact of nominal interest rate can have limited effects on economic activities. As a consequence, this can lessen the contribution of the real interest rate to economic growth. In developing countries which experience high inflation rates, the nominal interest rate can be decreased further, which can promote the growth in periods of crisis, but these countries also have a challenge because expansionary monetary policies can increase pressure on exchange rates. The risk of depreciation in currency can distress central banks pursue flexible policies to promote economic activity. So in both developed and developing countries, these limitations make it difficult to pursue expansionary monetary policies via interest rate policy during the current pandemic. The government intervention in the market via fiscal policy might be needed in order to support monetary policy. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, sir, for your very widened presentation. This is one of the best in terms of nowadays. The industrial production, the pandemic impact on industrial production is very important, and we see it with how interest rates relationship between these two items. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Actually, we have another guest from France. Iverson Lowe Joseph is interested in catastrophe economics. So Iverson Lowe Joseph will present us the economic consequences of the 2010 earthquakes in Haiti. Sir, you may share your screen if you have presentation. I'm leaving the microphone to you, sir. Dear Joseph, you hear me? Okay, perfect. Your microphone is muted right now. Could you please unmute? Okay, thank you very much.
I think everything is okay.
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear, and we can see your presentation, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Everson Love Joseph, and I'm a second year PhD student in economics at University of Caen, Normandy in France. The title of this new paper, which is in progress, is the economic consequences of the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. I am presenting this document for the first time, and I would like to have feedback to improve it. So the agenda for today's presentation is first introduction, data used, conceptual model, analysis and finding as in results, some finding and conclusion, limit and perspective. On January 2010, a powerful earthquake of moment magnitude scale 7.0 devastated Haiti and caused extensive damage. Port-au-Prince, the capital city close to the epicenter, has been hit hard and the country experienced significant destruction of its basic infrastructure. Cavallo et al. Estimated there's damages between 8 and 13 billion US dollars for 250 deaths and more than 300 injuries were recorded. Given this observation, the question of the impact of the earthquake on several important dimensions arises, and this research analyzes the dynamics of economic development in the country after the earthquake, which led us to ask the following research questions. First, what were the losses in terms of economic growth from the earthquake, and how did the different regions recover from this negative shock? Before answering these questions, we reviewed previous studies on the relationship between disasters and economic activity. We have grouped the consequences into two broad categories: positive effect on natural disasters like adoption of new technology, reinvestment or revolution of destroyed capital; negative effect on short and long term production, and there are some papers work on growth recovery after disaster. To achieve our goal, we use a variable annual data of nighttime light collected by the Defense Meteorological and Satellite Program of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and collected using satellite as an indicator of economic activities at regional level. Nighttime data is a reliable proxy for economic activity. We can also use nighttime data to estimate population, formal and informal economic activity. Nighttime data are very useful in area there is no are very useful, particularly helpful in places lacking in transparency of accurate statistics such as Haiti. Useful as there is no single measure of infrastructure, and there are some limitations like activities not appear in nighttime data. This graph you see is a still image of the country's economic activity in 2010. The capital city located in the western department is heavily lit compared to the rest of the country. Around the other major cities densely populated, light intensities are increasingly high. We also use land area data in square kilometers per pixel obtained from the Socioeconomic Data and Application Center. And this data were used to calculate weighted nighttime light, allowing comparison across the country. We use equally United States Geological Survey data on earthquake intensity measured on the modified Mercalli scale. So this graph was made by combining USGS data and the country's administrative boundaries map and present the average intensity per department. The brighter the color, the greater the average damage in the region. Standard deviation associated with the means are represented in the following table. As shown in this table, over the 22 years analysis, the pixel reached the maximum values 63 only in the Western department in 1992 and 2011. That is to say 0.008% of the pixel are saturated over the entire period. And you can see 87 of pixels are not lit in the Western department against more than 95% in the other department. So the distribution of the earthquake intensity is also presented in this same table. In the Western department, which is most affected by the earthquake, almost 49% of area were affected by an intensity level of more than 7.5. This explains why the damage was concentrated in this region, like you can see here. So the graph of evolution of nighttime light is presented here. It can be seen that nighttime light in different regions of the country have fluctuated up and down with an overall increasing trend. All curves decrease or change trend after the earthquake in 2010. In this case, the earthquake was used as a natural experiment and its intensity as an exogenous variable. And we consider areas affected by intensity level of at least or more than 5.5, 6.66 as treated. As treated, location with intensity below this threshold are the control groups. So to study regional development dynamic, we estimated a fixed effect difference in difference model presented in this table, where light GT is the percentage change in the growth of nighttime light in the department over the year T. Post T is a binary variable that takes 1 if the year is after the earthquake, 0 otherwise. MIEG is a binary variable representing the area affected by the intensity levels of 5, 5.5, 6, and so on. XGT are control variable for only area and saturated areas. Gamma GT is a time fixed effect. Delta GT is a region-specific linear trend. And following the literature, we first studied the stationarity of the panel, and impulse response functions were estimated to show a panel vector autoregressive model presented as this form. Y GT is a vector of dependent variables. X GT is a vector of exogenous covariates, and E GT is a vector of idiosyncratic errors. So this table presents the basic results of the DID model. All columns explore the effect of 1 unit change in the average Mercalli score on the growth of nighttime light intensities in the country. Column 1 and 2 first examine the bivariate relationship between different earthquake intensity threshold at nighttime light, controlling for year fixed effect. Column 3, 4 contain control for saturated pixel and unlit areas. Column 5 and 6 include control for nighttime light delayed by 1 period. And finally, column 7, 8, and 8 include region-specific linear trend. So the coefficient associated with the interaction between binary variables average intensity level of 5, 5.5, 6, and time variable paucity are not statistically significant. For average intensity level of more than 6.5, the effect is negative and significant. So the differential impact is minus 1.15% between the departments affected by an intensity level of at least 7 and the rest of the country. So we can say over the world, the decrease in light intensities is noted from the intensity level of at least 6.5. On the Mercalli scale, seismic shocks are considered strong and light damage at this intensity level. In this section, we present the impulse response function from the PVER model estimation. We obtain a global picture of the response of each department over a period of 10 years following the earthquake by controlling for only area and saturated pixel. The images are listed in these graphs. So the dash curve represents the confidence interval. As you can see, no decrease in light growth was observed in this graph for these intensity levels. Earthquake impact on nighttime light growth is negative in department affected by an intensity level of more than and equal to 6.5. The decrease is about 4% in the first year, and continues to decrease until reaching 13% in the 10th year in department affected by an average intensity level of at least 6.5. In terms of levels, this graph indicates that the earthquake caused a decrease in light in the country. In conclusion, by constructing a disaggregated panel database at the department level, we evaluated the losses in terms of economic growth following the earthquake, analyzes the dynamic of regional development according to the level of intensity recorded. Using a difference and difference model, we found that the earthquake was associated with a decrease in nighttime light growth in heavily affected areas. And impulse response functions show the persistence of these negative effects of the earthquake over time. Some robustness tests confirm also results. These negative effects on economic growth are similar to the result of other natural disaster studies like Cavallo et al., Noy et al., etc. We can say finally our empirical approach suffers from a lack of economic and social data at the disaggregated level, which is why we rely on nighttime light data. These negative impacts should be treated with caution since the analyses were conducted over a relatively short period of time after the earthquake. In addition, we do not have clearly identified control areas due to the small size of the country. And other post-earthquake crises could worsen the economic impact of the earthquake, while aid flow largely to the hard-hit areas could diminish the effect of the earthquake on economic growth. In perspective, in order to broaden the scope of this paper and deepen the analysis of development dynamic in the country, we could propose to extend this study period beyond 2013 using the visible infrared imaging radiometer suite data available since 2012 or the MSP extension. And we think harmonization of this data could stimulate further relevant studies. Thank you very much for your attention. Your comment and suggestion are greatly appreciated to help us improving the scientific quality of this work. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Joseph, for your presentation. Actually, we are out of time, but if there is a question or contribution regarding to all three presentations, we may take it. And also, if not, we will conclude this session, and 5 minutes later, we will start for the next session. Are there any questions? If you have questions, you may raise your hand, or you may write it on the chat site. I think probably none. I'd like to thank you all presenters for their valuable experience and researches that they share with us. Thank you for attending us. Thank you for being with us in this Sunday, very lovely weekend. Thank you very much for joining us. Now I'm concluding this sessions. I wish all the best for you. Please stay safe and healthy. Have a nice weekend and have a nice Sunday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. By the way, I won't end this session. I'm just stop recording.